Ken is an independent consultant who specializes in issues related to the communication of student achievement, especially grading and reporting. His 23-year teaching career includes experiences as a geography teacher, department head, and curriculum coordinator in Ontario, Canada, and Australia. He is generally acknowledged to be one of a small group of leading experts on how to grade and report effectively. And now, Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Telling me that I'm muted. Can you hear me, Brian?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Something came up on my screen that said I was muted, and that created some panic. So thank you, Brian, and thank you, everybody, for attending this afternoon. I hope that you will find this an interesting and worthwhile hour. The first thing I'd like to note that on this screen, you see my contact information. So if any of you would like to contact me directly after the webinar, you have my email, you have my website, and you have my Twitter handle. And I do like to be engaged in dialogue on Twitter and in the Standards-Based Learning and Grading Facebook group. The other thing I'd like to say by way of introduction, you will not have really any in this webinar pretty graphics or pictures. That's not me. Somebody described once my slides as being text heavy, and I've tried to reduce that, but they're still there. And so this is me. This is the way that I do presentations. I'm coming to you this afternoon from the Beaverton School District in Oregon. I've just spent a full day with 50 administrators and teachers. And I would like to thank the Beaverton School District for making it possible for me to do this webinar from their premises. Tonight, I'm going to fly home from Portland through Vancouver to Toronto, and this is my last work trip of the school year. So I'm looking forward to flights being on time tonight as a good way to end the year. Basically, the way I would describe the way that I have planned this webinar is that it is sort of my story around grading in the book, and it is a book tour, the development of the book and the issues and where those issues are in the book and what some of those issues are. Basically, in terms of the book and my history, it really involves three things: teach, test, and move on, assessment for learning, and grading for learning. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was in the classroom for 23 years. And I will have to admit, somewhat ashamedly, that I did a lot of teach, test, and move on. Recorded scores for student assessments, determined grades, mostly by simply calculating the mean. And I did that because I didn't know any better. I was never taught in service or pre-service how to do it any different. I basically did it the way that it was done to me, or the way that I was mentored early in my career. But in 1990, I became a curriculum coordinator in my school district. And in that role, I had some responsibilities for assessment across the district. And I was fortunate to be able to start seeing assessment in a different light, that we could use assessment for learning. And then over time, that became taking it from assessment for learning to grading for learning. And what enabled me to get a sense that assessment was more than teach, test, and move on was the opportunity I had in May of 1993 to attend a 3-day Train the Trainer session with Rick Stiggins in Toronto on classroom assessment. And this was, for me, and I think for many others, one of those life-changing experiences where things that I had done for years in the classroom, I realized that the ways that I could do it, I could and should have done it much better. That rather than teach, test, and move on, I should have been using, and there were all sorts of ways, as Rick showed us, that you can and should be assessing for learning. And as I said, that was a life-changing experience. I started to do work around assessment for learning in my school district. And in doing that work, I became interested in the role of grades and grading, because clearly, especially at the high school level, and I mostly taught at the high school level, grades are very, very important. They have a huge impact on students. They're very important to parents, and teachers spend an awful lot of time on them. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about grading. And I'm sorry it doesn't show up particularly clearly, but at the top is the title of an article, Practices and Policies, an Overview and Some Suggestions, that was written by a professor, Alan Ornstein, that was in the NASP Bulletin in April of 1994. And in that, as the title suggests, he suggested some things that teachers should be doing to make grading more effective. I felt that most of the things that he suggested were inappropriate. And I wrote a brief letter to the editor of the NASP Bulletin with some criticisms. About a month later, I got a letter from her in which she said, if you have some ideas, why don't you write an article? Well, at that point, I was just into criticizing. I wasn't into writing an article, so I basically ignored it. But a few months later, I got another letter from the editor, and in that letter, she had the responses from Professor Ornstein to my criticisms, and I thought his response made even less sense than his original article. And in that letter, again, she said, why don't you write an article? Well, twice challenged, I felt I had to respond. So I spent some time in the latter part of 1994, early 1995, thinking about what were other ways in which we could do grading more effectively, ways that support learning, support student success, because it was very clear that a lot of what we were doing in grading traditionally was really the opposite of that. It was very, very punitive. It was not about learning, it was about accumulating points. And in many cases, we had students who actually were not doing, who were doing quite well, who were getting low grades because of our grading practices. So I developed 8 guidelines for grading, wrote an article that appeared in the May 1995 issue of the NASP Bulletin, titled Guidelines for Grading that Support Learning and Student Success. And that article and those guidelines then became the base for a book, because people said to me, you know, there's a lot here, this is important. I think there's a lot that could be said that would make a very good book. And so I pitched the idea of that book to Skylight, who at that time were a small publisher operating out of just north of Chicago. And they agreed that it was a good idea. And so the first edition of How to Grade for Learning was published by Skylight in 1999, and it had a total number of pages of 192 pages. Now, very shortly after the book was published, Skylight was sold to Simon & Schuster. And very shortly after that, Simon & Schuster was bought by Pearson. So the book was originally a Skylight book. It then became a Pearson book. And after, I can't remember exactly how long, but after a few years, all the Skylight books were sold by Pearson to Corwin. So for most of its existence, How to Grade for Learning has been a Corwin book. And what I like to say is that I was traded 3 times without my knowledge or permission. And so that was the first edition of the book. A number of years later, it seemed that there were more that could and should be said. So a second edition was published by Corwin, and it became almost 100 pages longer. And then in 2009, a third edition of the book was published, again by Corwin, and it was about the same number of pages, different cover page, title obviously. And then a number of years went by, and it seemed that we'd learned a lot more, there was a lot more examples, and so it seemed like it was a good idea to do a 4th edition. And so the 4th edition, How has a 2018 imprint, although it was actually released in October of 2017. And as you can see, it is about 100 pages longer than the third edition. And this was the complete opposite of what the intention was when I started working on the fourth edition. The idea was that it was going to be a slimmer volume, but somehow or other that didn't work out. And the main reason why it didn't work out is because I believe that when you do new editions of a book, it has to have value added. It's not simply making a few changes. And so in the fourth edition, there are 48 educator contributions from 41 American, Canadian, and international educators. And some of those educator contributions are quite long. So a lot of the extra 100 pages comes from those educator contributions. But I believe they really added a lot of value to the book. So a great deal of the value in the book is not what I wrote, but what these 41 educators from all around the world wrote. There are some other, maybe some of you who are familiar with previous editions, especially the third edition, and there are some other fairly significant changes. The idea of how do we determine grades, which in earlier editions was putting it all together, was incorporated into Chapter 6, Guideline 6. And then I added a completely new chapter on implementing changes in grading and reporting. And it basically consists entirely of educator contributions, so different ideas about how to effectively implement changes in grading and reporting from American, Canadian, and international educators, with just a little bit of commentary by me. And I also added about 100 new references. So for those of you that haven't seen the fourth edition, those are the major changes from the third edition, and sort of the history, in a sense, of the development of the book, the development of my thinking on grading for learning. And all of my work, the original article, the 4 editions of How to Grade for Learning, has been based on these 8 guidelines. Guidelines, as I said, to support learning and to encourage student success. And what I want to do is to talk about some of the main issues that I see as the main issues today and relate them to these guidelines. And so the issues that I would like to address around the terminology that we use, the purpose for grades, some of the issues around standards-based assessment and grading, with the focus on standards-based, the use of levels, not points or percentages, and how we use the guidelines for grading to develop a learning culture, and then some other, which I would consider to be important issues. For each of the issues, as you listen to the presentation, I would like to suggest that this is a helpful way of thinking about them in terms of your own practices, your own beliefs. Is what I'm suggesting, does it affirm? And so things that you should keep doing. Are there some things maybe that you could or should fine-tune, things that you would refine? And are there some things around these issues that basically challenge your current practices or beliefs? And if I'm challenging them, maybe you need to think about change, which could involve stopping, doing some things. It could involve starting, doing others. So I hope that you see that as a useful way of thinking about, as a thinking frame for each of the issues. So the first issue is terminology. And terminology is an issue because we have so much terminology in education, and we have terms that are used differently in different places. And if I'm using a term with one meaning and you have a different understanding of that term, we really don't have any sort of a useful discussion. The terms that we use frequently often have different meanings in different places. And this is not very helpful to professional dialogue. And so I make a distinction between grades or grading and marks or marking and scoring. For me, grades are the symbol, the number or letter that at the end of a period of time we put on report cards as a summary statement of student performance. Traditionally letter grades and percentages, now more sometimes as levels. Marks or scores for me are the number or the letters or the words that we place on a single student assessment to indicate the value of that, often done as 7 out of 10 or a rubric score. And I make this distinction because there are two very different processes involved. When I am marking or scoring the value of an individual piece of student assessment evidence, that's a very different process when I'm summarizing those for a symbol, a grade on a report card. As they are different processes, I think we communicate more clearly if we use different terms for them. Now, I'm not trying to change the way anybody uses these terms. I just want to be clear about how I'm using them. And so I know, for example, that most commonly the term grades is used for both of these in the US, and the term marks is used for both of these in Canada. So in each case, one term is used with a double meaning. It's just the reverse terminology. The other terms that I think we need to have an understanding about whether they're the same or different are the labels that we use now for our learning goals. Our standards, some places called expectations, some places called outcomes, some places called competencies. And I know for some of these people make fine distinctions, but at least for this afternoon, you'll notice I have equal signs. And so I am basically treating these as being the same as alternative labels that I guess generically we would call learning goals. The next issue that is absolutely critical is purpose, that we are very clear about the purpose of assessment. We're very clear about the purpose of grading. In the chapter of a book in 1996, Tom Guskey summarized what he saw from the literature, in talking to educators, what he said, people said were the main purposes for which we've used grades, that they've had a communication role, a self-evaluation role, a sorting and selecting role, a motivational role, and a program evaluation role. And somehow or other, we have expected that little summary symbols could do all of those things and all of them well at the same time. But as Sue Brookhart pointed out, it's very difficult for one measure to serve different purposes equally well. But the main difficulty is that with that list of purposes, we're asking them to serve conflicting purposes. If we take the first purpose, the communication purpose, to its logical conclusion, what we would want to be doing is communicating the highest possible student achievement in the narrowest possible range. If we take the third purpose to its logical conclusion, what we need to do is spread them out as much as possible. So those two purposes are in conflict. And so I think what we have to do is we have to prioritize the purpose of grades. We have to establish what we believe is the primary purpose of grades, because the primary purpose will be then what determines our decisions about how we're going to go about do grading. And along with Brookhart, I believe we should see the primary purpose of grades as communicating with students and parents about their achievement of the learning goals, how they're doing on standards. And so the whole premise of the book is based on the idea that communicating student achievement is the primary purpose for grades. If I had a different belief about the primary purpose of grades, I would go in very different directions than I will be going from this point forward. And I am fairly active participant in some of the Facebook groups and the Twitter chats, and it was very interesting. I obviously planned this some time ago, but over the last week in some of those social media, a number of times the issue of purpose has come up, and the need for us to be clear about purpose as the guide to deciding what we do. I think we also need to be clear about the primary purpose of classroom assessment, and that the primary purpose of classroom assessment is to inform teaching and improve learning. It's about gathering information so that teachers can make adjustments and students can make adjustments. The primary purpose of classroom assessment is not to sort and select students or to justify grades. And I think especially at the high school level, we've often seen it that way. And so I think it's really important that we that we see the primary purpose of classroom assessment as informing instruction and informing learning for students, and that we see sorting and selecting and justifying grades as very much a secondary purpose. So the next issue is being standards-based in assessment and grading. How do we do that? And the way we do that is to relate our grading procedures to the learning goals. We use the learning goals as the basis for grade determination and grade reporting. And we use the assessment methods as the subset, not the set. And so what I have done for this webinar is, as you see here, put the guideline, my guideline, and also the quote or quotes that I use to introduce it. So this actually comes from the first page of chapter 1 that deals with guideline 1. So you can see there that there is, and for all of them, there are one or more quotes that relate to the issue. And so for this chapter, there is a quote from a Missouri educator. Traditionally, and I'll admit that I did this when I was in the classroom, I organized my collection of evidence of student achievement by assessment methods or activities. I had categories for quizzes and tests, for assignments, for presentations, and so on. Sometimes I weighted those categories, as you see on the right-hand side. Sometimes I simply accumulated points within each of those categories. And that gives us some vaguely useful information, but it doesn't give us particularly useful information. And so this is an example of that type of an assessment that was given as an interim report card to a student in 1995. The categories in the teacher's gradebook were tests, daily work, and lab work. And in this, you can see the scores that the student got, and you can see what those scores were as a percentage. Now, what I have left out of this, and what is in the text in the book but not in the figure, is the grade that the student got as a summary grade on this interim report card. And so what I would ask you to do is to eyeball the right-hand column, the percentages, and just think about it for a few seconds. What grade do you think this student got on the report card in percentage ranges? 90 to 100, 80 to 89, 70 to 79, and so on. My guess is that most of you either said 70 to 79 or 60 to 69. And those of you that said 60 to 69 would be correct, because the grade that was on this interim report card was 68.8%, which is mathematically correct given the weighting for the tests, the daily work, and the lab work. But it clearly doesn't tell us very much about this student's learning, particularly because there was one test that the student didn't do. So organizing by the assessment methods doesn't tell us very much of value. And then there are obviously other issues. But if we take basically the same content, the same learning, and put that with the NGSS science standards, take the standards that science course was basically about, now we would organize it by the standards. And so you can see on the left-hand side the 6 standards that were probably involved in 1995. And I'd like to thank Ken Mattingly from Kentucky, who helped me to establish what they were. And you can see here now that we have a series of scores for each of those standards. And on the right-hand side, we summarize for each of those standards. And we now have a profile of the student's performance. There are 3 standards on which they're excelling. There's 1 standard on which they're approaching proficiency, the 2. There is 1 standard on which the student didn't provide sufficient information, 2 missing, and a 1. That's not enough information to make a summary judgment, so the summary is an I for incomplete. And there was 1 standard on which the teacher only provided 2 opportunities. The student was inconsistent on those 2 opportunities, so the way that we have to summarize that is not assessed. There wasn't enough information. And clearly, I think this provides a much richer picture of the student's achievement, much more valuable information for the student themselves, much more valuable information for teachers, and much more valuable information for students. And Ken Mattingly, who does this, in his educator contribution in the book, is basically a letter that he shares with parents. And I thought this was a useful thing. In fact, I've seen many people on social media ask Ken for his materials. And I just highlighted a few things that he had in that letter to parents. For each unit, students will receive a list of learning targets that are written in student-friendly language. Students will be assessed throughout the unit to see how they're doing on the targets. And the grading process, as he says, will allow students to have ownership of their grades. They'll have the opportunity to improve on and know how to improve. So seeing learning as that ongoing process of getting better on the standards. And ultimately, I think this is what being standards-based around the what of the learning is about. The biggest issue, I think, around this that we still have to address is summed up in the quote at the top of this slide. And that is that one symbol cannot do justice to the different degrees of learning a student acquires across all learning outcomes. Still, very often at the high school level, at the middle school level, we are providing grades for subjects. Sometimes that's the only thing we provide. And I think we have to recognize that that doesn't really provide us very useful information. It gives us a broad general idea of students' achievement, but nothing more. And so I think determining subject grades is not something that has a lot of value. And I believe that there should be no subject grades until at least grade 9. In other words, up to the end of middle school, there is no reason for subject grades, only grades for standards. Ideally, I would want to see that continue not until grade 11, because I think 2 years of data are sufficient for the external purposes for GPAs and college admission and so on. But I recognize that we'll probably continue in most places to have subject grades throughout high school. But from an educational point of view, from a communication point of view, I see no reason for that in grade 9 and grade 10. The next issue that comes up continually is the issue of what are our performance standards? How do we score student work? How do we identify how good is good enough? And that really is about our performance standards. They tell us how good is good enough. They're the indicators of quality, but there are some real issues with how we've done performance standards. And this is really the next little quote that starts the chapter is the description, or is it from a cartoon, from a Family Circus cartoon. 5 right and 5 wrong is batting 500. And in baseball, that's really good. But clearly, in almost all settings in school, it's not good. So we have to really think about what are our performance standards and what do they mean. And basically, I think what we need are clear descriptions of criteria and reference performance standards. The meaning of grades, whether we use letters or numbers, whatever is our symbol system, should come from clear descriptions of a limited number of levels. When we think about this as it relates to percentages, that so often has been the base of what we've done. What is a satisfactory performance in terms of percentage? For landing as plane safely, nothing less than 100% is acceptable. I'm going to take 2 flights tonight, and I hope we have 100% perfect landings. In baseball, hitting successfully 40% is superb. It only happened once. Hitting 30% is excelling. Salary of probably 10 million plus. Hitting 20% is minimally proficient. You'll keep a job in the major leagues. Put 20 to 40% in almost any other setting, it's a low level of performance. Contrast that with free throws in basketball or success in curling. The numbers are very different. Why the difference? Because of different levels of difficulty in the skills or what is actually needed. And so traditionally, we have linked percentages, often to letters, and to 1 or 2 word descriptors. But that assumes that everything is of equal difficulty. And clearly that's not the case. So in standards-based approaches, we start with the idea of proficiency, and then we decide how many levels we want to have below proficiency and how many levels above. In a pure standards-based system, we would only have 2 levels, proficient, not proficient. And maybe that's appropriate for kindergarten, maybe grade 1, maybe even grade 2. But I think when we get beyond that, it makes sense that we want to make finer distinctions. We want to make a distinction between those who are close to proficiency and further away. And we want to make distinctions for those who are excelling. We want to both acknowledge and encourage excellence. Basically, if we think in terms of 4 levels, I think these are our 4 levels. Now, I'm not suggesting we would ever use these words in any formal document, but I think if we think about them in this way, we can develop a clear sense and complete wording for what the levels are. And so an example, I'll show you in a minute an example of that. But we also have to recognize that we shouldn't be using percentages. Our performance standards, a standards-based system and the percentage system are basically incompatible. As Guskey points out, it's a false sense, an illusion of precision that is provided by percentages. And that what we need to be using are integer grading systems, systems of equal difference, systems of levels, because they're more meaningful, they're more reliable, and they make the judgment process that teachers do more accurate and more honest. And so here is an example of the descriptors for different levels from an English teacher in Michigan from one of the educator contributions in the book. And you'll notice he has descriptors for what is necessary for 3 levels of performance, A, B, and C, and then his 4th level is incomplete. But what you'll notice is that there is not a number to be seen. These are qualitative descriptions of different levels of performance. And that, I believe, is what we need to have effective performance standards. Because of that variation in difficulty, if we use points-based assessments, percentages or scores, for example, out of 20, if we're thinking in terms of levels, we need to think about that there will be different cut scores depending on whether the assessment itself or the skills or the concepts are easy, moderate, or difficult. If we have easy assessments or easy concepts or skills, the cut scores for the levels are fairly high. If it's moderate difficulty, the cut scores will be a bit lower. And if it's difficult, the assessment itself or the skills or the concept, the cut scores are much lower again. Because what we're going to record in our gradebook are the levels, not the points or the percentages. But if we do percentage or points-based assessment, we have to make this relationship. We have to develop little tables that show what these differences are. When it comes time for those levels where we have to, where we're still required to have summary grades for subjects, I think the best way to do it is with logic rules. And so this is an example of a logic rule from a high school in Oregon. And so if you look at this, you'll see that an A is students getting all 3s and 4s with a majority of 4s. A B is all 3s and 4s with a majority of 3s. A C is a mix of levels, mostly level 3 and level 2, but no 1s. Now, in this school, they choose to only do A, B, and C. If we want to have more, then we just make our logic rules more precise. But I think this is by far the best way to work from levels to summary grades for subjects. Maybe the single most important thing is that we need to develop a learning culture in our schools. And I think traditional grading has created a grade grubbing culture. And there are a number of things I think that we can do to develop a learning culture. We need to provide students time to learn. We need students time to make mistakes, to relearn, and then be assessed. And that aspect is addressed in Guideline 4. We also need to emphasize more recent evidence. The idea that assessment isn't a one-shot deal, that students have multiple opportunities, that it's about their learning over time, and that is part of developing that learning culture. That is addressed in Guideline 5. We need to develop students as reflective, self-directed learners. We need to involve students in the assessment and grading process. And when they become reflective, self-directed learners, they will then develop as lifelong learners. If they're grade grubbers, that's unlikely to ever happen. And the last aspect of developing a learning culture, I think, is that we need to align what we do with what we believe. That we have very often now in schools mission and vision statements where we say this is what we believe, this is what we're about, but we need to check, and that almost always is about developing learners and things along those lines. But I think in many cases we say these are our principles, but we haven't aligned our assessment and grading procedures with what we believe. So it's about really reflecting on, is what you do aligned with what you believe? And so that part is really about our principles, the values that orient us, and both as individuals and as organizations. And so this is an example of a mission statement from an international school in Asia. And you'll notice through italicizing, I've highlighted some words. They talk about having a nurturing learning environment, about promoting responsibility and respect, developing socially engaged, self-motivated, creative, compassionate individuals. All of those have implications for what we do in instruction, what we do in assessment, and what we do in grading, aligning with our beliefs with what we actually do. There are also our personal principles that hopefully align with the institutional principles. And if they don't, I guess what we have to do is go somewhere else. But for me, two important personal principles are that students don't need grades to learn well, and teachers don't need them to teach well. We can and do have great teaching and great learning without grades, but we very often act in schools as if they're an essential part of what we do. And then the obvious one, that schools should have a learning culture, not a grading culture. So in terms of the specific guidelines that relate to creating a culture of learning, Guideline 4 is, I think, maybe the most important. And that is, from what purpose of assessments does our information go into determination of grades? That we shouldn't include assessments used for formative purposes in grades. The purpose of formative assessment is to get information to students and teachers by which they adjust the teaching and the learning processes. So it's about feedback. It's about words in rubrics, in checklists, and not scores. And the evidence that we use to determine grades should primarily come from summative assessments. And so in the book, in very early in Guideline 4, Chapter 4, I have a comparison of formative assessment and summative assessments in terms of purpose, in terms of the time of assessment when this happens in the learning process, the types of assessments that we most commonly use as formative and summative assessments, the use we make of the assessment information, and how we share it with students. And I hope that that is a useful way of making clear the contrast between formative assessment and summative assessment. One of the educator contributions in the book is from Hugh O'Donnell, who is a retired middle school teacher, also by chance from Oregon. And Hugh developed an idea of a number of reasons for not including formative assessment in grades. And you can see that he had 7 reasons why formative assessment shouldn't be part of grades. And while you're glancing over those, I would add a couple to Hugh's list at the bottom. I think this deals with what is often a real problem with students, which is the does this count syndrome. We have students do something and does this count? Well, the message that students have to have is that everything counts. Some is practice, some is performance. And I think what is important about that is that students understand that in band and basketball. They know in band and basketball that practice counts. And we know we need them to have that same understanding in the classroom. And that understanding develops if and when formative assessment has no place in grades. Summative assessment is what we use for grades. That we only are going to evaluate you when you have had the opportunity to learn, to take advantage of the learning process. Guideline 5 is about learning and assessment over time. And again, as with all of them, some introductory quotes, and then the basic guideline that in this case is stated a little bit tritely, grade in pencil. But the basic idea is we have our records so that they can be updated easily. And when it comes time to determine grades, we use the most consistent level of achievement with emphasis on the more recent information. When the teaching and learning process goes well, students move from not knowing, not understanding, or not understanding and knowing well, to knowing and understanding well. And so if we see that progression over time, when it comes time to make those summary judgments, we should be emphasizing the more recent information. And one of the things that I'm sure many of you have seen, I had it in the first edition of the book, it's been used by lots of other people, is this idea of parachute packing, that we have 3 students who took part in a parachute packing course. The horizontal line is the competency or mastery level. The dashed line are the scores for student 1, the solid line are the scores for student 2, the dotted line are the scores for student 3. And the idea in this is that you are going to do a skydive and you're going to use a parachute packed by one of these student parachute packers. And based on this information, which one would you choose? Knowing that the parachutes that you are choosing from were packed after the course was over. So in terms of the timeline, we're off the right-hand side of the graph. And I have used this over the years in probably hundreds of groups with different teachers. A few years ago, there used to be those that would choose student 2 and student 1. Now, almost exclusively, teachers choose student 3, the student that had difficulty at the beginning, but has mastered it at the end. And I think what's important to think about this is, if these were scores in a grade book, and we determine grades in the way we have traditionally, students 1 and 2 would pass and student 3 would fail. We honor the learning process when we emphasize more recent evidence. And that is shown also in these learning curves for 4 students, Bob, Gwen, Roger, and Pam. Now, you've all taught Bob, Gwen, Roger, and Pam. They had different names. But Bob is basically the student who, in a sense, doesn't need us. Gwen is the fairly typical successful student. Sometimes we see learning curves like Roger and Pam. But all 4 of these students are achieving at the same level at the end. And by emphasizing the more recent evidence, they all get the same grade, which is an accurate representation of their achievement and honors the learning process. And I love this quote from Tom Schimmer, that when we don't do this, it's only in school that are we penalized for not knowing then what we know now. When we emphasize the more recent evidence, we don't do that. Guideline 8 is the guideline about involving students in the assessment process throughout the teaching learning process, that age appropriately. We ensure that students understand how they'll be assessed, how their grades will be determined if we have grades, and we involve them in the process. We involve them in the process through self-assessment, through reflection, through goal setting, and involving them in communicating about their achievement and their progress. In his educator contribution, Myron Dewick from British Columbia said, in terms of helping students understand the assessment and grading process, the extent to which we do that depends on questions that we need to think about. Do I want to increase student engagement? Do I want students to reflect on their own learning? Do I want to create a learning environment that is welcoming to all students? And I would hope that every teacher would answer yes to those. And if that's the case, then we have to involve students in the process. We have to say in our classrooms, it's about learning. It's not just about accumulating points. There are some other important issues that I'd like to deal with fairly quickly. And one is that achievement is and has to be the grading variable. I think one of the problems that we've had with grading is that we've mixed achievement and behavior together. And so guideline 3 addresses the issue of grades being based on achievement only, that effort, participation, attitude, behaviors are reported separately. This is the only way that we develop grades that have real meaning, grades that are accurate. And so the basic idea that's involved in this is illustrated in this graphic. The outside rectangle is everything that students do. The inside rectangle is what we select to assess. Some of it's process, some of it's product. We put it together, it's achievement. That is how they're doing on the standards. Those are or should be the grading variables. All of the things in the little box on the left-hand side are very, very important. I'm not minimizing their importance, but unless they are specifically mentioned in the standards, they are desirable behaviors. They are not achievement in and of themselves. And so we should report on those separately, so that in that way we show we have accurate grades because they're about achievement only, but we show that we value some behaviors, some learning skills by reporting on those separately. Part of Guideline 3 then is some of the things that we have often done that have included, in a sense, behavior and grades. So part of this guideline is that we shouldn't reduce marks for late work. We shouldn't give points for extra credit or bonus points. We shouldn't punish academic dishonesty with reduced grades. Academic dishonesty is a behavior, an unacceptable, reprehensible behavior. And so the first level of consequence should be behavioral consequences. And in no way should we include attendance in grade determination. And another behavior that has often found its way into grades is using group scores in grades. When students do cooperative learning, they come up with products or performances as a group. And very often we have then used group scores in the past traditionally. But there's only one student's name on the report card. So the strategy is called cooperative learning. After we do cooperative learning, we should do individual assessment to find out what they know and understand and can do as a result of the cooperative learning. A huge issue in many places that causes great wailing and gnashing of teeth, and in which there was quite a discussion on one of the Twitter feeds recently, is the issue of zeros, which we most commonly use for missing work. And so if we had 5 assessments and Janice got those 5 scores, or 4 scores, didn't do the 5th one, the total would be 310, the mean would be 62, the median would be 76. And I would argue that both of those are a misrepresentation of the student's achievement. There are a number of very serious problems. The extreme scores, the outliers, have a huge impact when we average. I mean, we teach in grade 5 about not having outliers when we use the mean. Also, we have the problem that there's a huge number of points between 0 and whatever is our cut point for pass-fail, compared with the smaller differentials for A's, B's, and C's and D's. When we use zeros, we absolutely have inaccurate communication. My example of Janice, including the 0, meant that any summary was not an accurate representation. And I think, the argument that are often made for zeros is if a student hasn't done it, then it should get a 0 and that will make them accountable, when in fact, or responsible. In fact, exactly the reverse happens. Basically what zeros say is, now you don't have to do it, which is the opposite of responsibility, accountability. And so there are some alternatives to zeros. If we have 5 assessments, as you see on the left-hand side, student gets 95, 85, 75, 65, and 0. The mean would be 64, which is lower than any of the scores the student actually gets. The median would be 75, which is at least somewhat representative. And that's what would happen when we use the percentage scale. If instead we used a 5-point scale, an equal difference scale, then we could use a 0 as the bottom level, because it's an equal difference scale, and what comes out of that mathematically is accurate, and it's a reasonable summary. But what we really need to do, if we're using percentages, is we need to turn it into a 50-point scale. We need to turn it into a scale with equal differences. So we have basically 10 points for an A, a B, a C, and a D. And if we do that, then again, the calculation is at least more reasonable. It's still not really an accurate representation, but if we're hooked into using a percentage scale, I think that's what we have to do. But the basic issue is, do we have enough evidence to make valid and reliable judgments? If the answer is yes, the grade should be determined without the missing piece. If the answer is no, then what really should be recorded is incomplete or insufficient evidence, because this communicates accurately that the student's grade could be anything, but at this point, we don't have enough evidence to determine the grade. And if we don't have enough evidence, we shouldn't be determining grades. I think that implementing these guidelines is difficult. As Defoe, Iker, and Defoe pointed out, it requires, in many cases, significant changes in schools. It requires a change in structure, the policies, the programs, the procedures, but ultimately it's about culture. It's about the beliefs, the assumptions that constitutes the norm. And that's why I really want to emphasize the idea that ultimately grading for learning is about changing the culture of schools from a culture of grading to a culture of learning. And in order for that to happen, I think teachers and administrators have to become reflective practitioners, especially as it relates to grading. And we have to continually focus on the question, does what you do align with what you believe?